Have you ever experienced a night so terrifying that it changed your life forever? In today's video, I'm sharing a chilling true story about an elderly lady who thought she was safe with her loyal dog by her side. But what she discovered one morning turned her world upside down. Imagine reaching down for comfort in the dead of night, only to find out that the comforting presence wasn't your pet, but something far more sinister. Join me as I unravel the horrifying events of that fateful night, the disturbing message left behind, and the lingering fear that still haunts her to this day. This isn't just a tale of terror, it's a stark reminder of how quickly our sense of safety can be shattered. If you love real-life horror stories that keep you on the edge of your seat, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a story that will send chills down your spine. Let's dive into this eerie tale together. There was an elderly lady who lived alone with her beloved dog in a quaint, quiet town. The town was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and safety was never a major concern. The lady and her dog had a simple but fulfilling routine. Every morning, they would go for a walk around the neighborhood, greeting their neighbors and enjoying the fresh air. The dog was a small, fluffy companion who followed her everywhere. He slept beside her bed every night, providing her with a sense of comfort and security. Their bond was deep. He was not just a pet but her loyal friend and protector. She often talked to him as if he were a person, and he seemed to understand her every word. Their days were filled with small, comforting rituals. They would have breakfast together, with the dog patiently waiting for his share. In the afternoons, they would sit in the garden, the lady reading a book while the dog lounged in the sun. Life was peaceful and predictable, just the way she liked it. But recently, there had been unsettling news that disrupted their tranquil life. An escaped prisoner was on the loose, and the police warned everyone to stay vigilant. The man was considered dangerous, and the thought of him being in the area filled the lady with dread. She tried to stay calm, but the news had cast a shadow over her usually serene existence. Despite the fear, the lady continued her routine, finding solace in her dog's presence. She felt safe with him around, knowing that he would alert her if anything was wrong. At night, when the darkness seemed to amplify her worries, she would reach down and let her dog lick her hand. This simple act reassured her and helped her fall asleep. One particularly cold winter evening, the lady felt more anxious than usual. The news about the fugitive was all over the radio, and the police had intensified their search efforts. She tried to stay composed, but every little noise outside made her jump. Her dog, sensing her unease, stayed close by her side, offering silent comfort. As bedtime approached, the lady went through her usual routine, double-checking the locks on her doors and windows. She knew it was unlikely that the fugitive would come to her house, but she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Her dog followed her to the bedroom, settling down in his usual spot beside the bed. That night, sleep did not come easily. The lady tossed and turned, her mind racing with thoughts of the escaped prisoner. Eventually, she reached down and felt her dog's warm, reassuring lick on her hand. The familiar sensation helped calm her nerves, and she finally drifted off to sleep. In the middle of the night, she was startled awake by a noise outside. Her heart pounded in her chest as she lay still, straining to hear. After a few moments, she convinced herself it was just the wind. To reassure herself, she reached down again, feeling the comforting lick of her dog's tongue. She sighed with relief and closed her eyes, willing herself to relax. Morning came, and the lady woke up feeling more rested. The previous night's fears seemed distant in the light of day. She got out of bed, ready to start her day. But as she opened the door to her bedroom, she was met with a horrifying sight. Her beloved dog lay on the floor, brutally killed. Blood was everywhere, and on the walls written in the dog's blood were the chilling words, "A human's can lick too." She stood there, frozen in terror, trying to comprehend what had happened. The comfort she had felt from her dog's presence was shattered in an instant. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The licks she had felt during the night were not from her dog, but from the escaped prisoner. The horror of that moment stayed with her, a haunting reminder of how close she had come to real danger. The peaceful life she once knew was forever changed by that night of terror. That night, the elderly lady sat in her living room, listening to the news on the radio. The announcer's voice was tense, reporting that the escaped prisoner was still at large. Authorities believed he was hiding somewhere in the area, and they urged everyone to stay indoors and keep their doors locked. Each update made her heart beat a little faster, her anxiety growing with every word. She looked at her beloved dog, who sat by her feet, sensing her unease. His presence was usually a source of great comfort to her. Whenever she felt scared or lonely, he was always there, ready to offer his silent support. Tonight, she needed that comfort more than ever. As the evening wore on, she tried to distract herself with her favorite book, but the words blurred on the page. She couldn't focus on the story, her mind kept drifting back to the news reports. The thought of a dangerous fugitive being so close to her home was terrifying. Eventually, she decided it was time for bed. She went through her nightly routine, checking all the locks on the doors and windows. She even moved a chair in front of the front door, just for an extra sense of security. Her dog followed her around the house, his little paws patting softly on the wooden floors. Finally, she headed to her bedroom, her dog right behind her. She changed into her nightgown and got into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the old wooden beams and the soft hum of the wind outside. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Lying there in the dark, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every little noise seemed amplified, every shadow seemed to move. She knew she needed to calm down, but it was hard with the fear gnawing at her. She reached down to where her dog always lay beside the bed. As her hand touched his fur, she felt his warm, wet tongue licking her hand. It was a simple, familiar gesture, but it brought her a sense of peace. The tension in her body eased, and she let out a long, slow breath. This was their routine. Whenever she got scared, she would reach down, and her dog would lick her hand, reassuring her that everything was okay. It had worked countless times before, and tonight was no different. The rhythmic licking soothed her, making her feel safe and protected. Gradually, her racing thoughts began to slow, and her eyelids grew heavy. She focused on the comforting presence of her dog, his steady breathing, and the gentle licks on her hand. It was enough to help her drift off to sleep, despite the fear that had been gripping her earlier. In the middle of the night, she woke up briefly, startled by a noise outside. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she lay still, listening intently. After a few moments, she convinced herself it was just the wind. To reassure herself, she reached down again, feeling the familiar lick of her dog's tongue. She sighed with relief and closed her eyes, feeling the comfort wash over her once more. Morning came, and the lady woke up feeling more rested. The previous night's fears seemed distant in the light of day. She got out of bed, ready to start her day. But as she opened the door to her bedroom, she was met with a horrifying sight. Her beloved dog lay on the floor, brutally killed. Blood was everywhere, and on the walls written in the dog's blood were the chilling words, "A humans can lick too." She stood there, frozen in terror, trying to comprehend what had happened. The comfort she had felt from her dog's presence was shattered in an instant. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The licks she had felt during the night were not from her dog, but from the escaped prisoner. The horror of that moment stayed with her, a haunting reminder of how close she had come to real danger. The peaceful life she once knew was forever changed by that night of terror. That night, the lady's fear was almost palpable. The ongoing manhunt for the escaped prisoner dominated every news report, and the constant updates made her feel more and more anxious. She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. As she prepared for bed, she checked the locks on her doors and windows multiple times, a habit she had developed in the past few days. Each click of the lock gave her a momentary sense of security, but the fear lingered. Her dog followed her closely, his presence a small comfort amidst the rising tension. Once in her bedroom, she tried to distract herself with a book, but her mind kept wandering back to the news. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside made her jump. The usually comforting sounds of her home now seemed sinister. She climbed into bed, pulling the covers tightly around her. The darkness felt oppressive, and her anxiety was at an all-time high. Her dog settled beside the bed, his presence a constant source of reassurance. She reached down, feeling the soft fur beneath her fingers. In her distress, she lowered her hand further, and as expected, her dog licked her hand. This simple, familiar action had always been a source of comfort. The gentle rhythmic licks helped to soothe her frayed nerves. It was their nightly ritual, one that made her feel safe even in the darkest times. Gradually, the tension in her body began to ease. The rhythmic licks of her dog's tongue grounded her, allowing her to focus on something other than her fear. She took deep breaths, trying to let go of the anxiety that had built up throughout the evening. As she lay there, her breathing slowed, and her heart rate returned to normal. The comfort her dog provided was enough to help her drift off to sleep. She trusted him completely, knowing that he would alert her if anything was wrong. In the middle of the night, she woke briefly, startled by a noise outside. Her heart raced again, but she reached down and felt the reassuring lick of her dog's tongue. With that familiar comfort, she was able to calm herself and fall back asleep. The night passed without further incident, and the lady woke up the next morning feeling unexpectedly rested. The daylight brought a sense of normalcy, and she felt relieved that the night had ended peacefully. She got out of bed, ready to start her day. But as she opened her bedroom door, a horrifying sight greeted her. Her beloved dog lay on the floor, brutally killed. Blood was everywhere, and written on the walls in the dog's blood were the chilling words, "A humans can lick too." She stood there, frozen in terror, unable to process what she was seeing. The comfort she had felt from her dog's presence the previous night was shattered in an instant. The realization hit her hard. The licks she had felt were not from her dog, but from the escaped prisoner. The horror of that moment stayed with her, a haunting reminder of how close she had come to real danger. The peaceful life she once knew was forever changed by that night of terror. The next morning, the lady woke up feeling unusually calm. The fear and anxiety from the night before seemed like a distant memory. She stretched in bed, grateful for the presence of her loyal dog who had comforted her through the night. For a brief moment, everything felt normal. She got out of bed, thinking about making breakfast and taking her dog for a walk. The sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow in the room. She smiled, feeling a sense of relief that the night had passed without incident. As she opened her bedroom door, the calmness shattered instantly. She gasped, her heart skipping a beat, as she saw her beloved dog lying lifeless on the floor. Blood was splattered everywhere, a gruesome sight that made her stomach churn. Her eyes widened in horror as she took in the scene. The once comforting presence of her dog was now replaced by a scene of brutality. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. She felt a wave of dizziness, her legs threatening to give out beneath her. On the walls, written in the dog's blood, were the chilling words, "A humans can lick too." The sight of the message sent a cold shiver down her spine. It was a message filled with malice and terror, confirming her worst fears. She stumbled backward, her hand covering her mouth as she tried to stifle a scream. The realization hit her hard. The licks she had felt during the night were not from her dog. The escaped prisoner had been in her room, right beside her, while she thought she was safe. Shock turned into disbelief. How could this have happened? She had checked all the locks, taken every precaution. Yet, the intruder had still managed to get inside. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one more terrifying than the last. Overwhelming fear gripped her as she realized just how close she had come to real danger. The safety and security she had always felt in her home were shattered. She felt violated, knowing that someone had been in her most private space, committing such a heinous act. She reached for the phone with trembling hands, dialing the police. Her voice shook as she tried to explain what had happened. The dispatcher reassured her that help was on the way, but it did little to calm her racing heart. As she waited for the police to arrive, she couldn't take her eyes off the message on the wall. The words seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, a constant reminder of the horror she had narrowly escaped. She hugged herself, trying to find some semblance of comfort, but it was no use. When the police finally arrived, they quickly took in the scene. Their faces mirrored the shock and horror she felt. They began their investigation, but the lady knew that no amount of questioning would erase the fear that had taken root in her heart. The officers spoke to her gently, asking questions and trying to piece together what had happened. She answered as best as she could, her voice shaking with every word. They assured her that they would do everything in their power to catch the fugitive, but the reassurance felt hollow. As the day wore on, the house that had once been a place of comfort and safety now felt like a prison of fear. The memory of the night before, the feeling of the licks, and the horrifying discovery of her dog would haunt her forever. The peaceful life she once knew was gone, replaced by an unending sense of dread. As soon as she saw the horrific scene in her bedroom, the lady's first instinct was to call the police. Her hands trembled as she dialed the number, her voice breaking as she explained what she had found. The dispatcher tried to calm her down, promising that officers were on their way. The police arrived swiftly, their lights flashing and sirens blaring. They approached the house cautiously, aware of the potential danger. The lady stood at the door, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. She ushered them inside, desperate for their help. The officers quickly assessed the scene, their expressions grim as they took in the bloody message on the wall and the lifeless body of her beloved dog. They spoke to her gently, trying to piece together what had happened. She recounted the events of the night before, her voice shaking with every word. The police began their investigation, searching the house for any clues. They dusted for fingerprints, looked for signs of forced entry, and scoured the area for anything that might lead them to the fugitive. The lady watched, her heart heavy with dread, as they combed through her home. One of the officers found a broken window at the back of the house, confirming that the intruder had indeed found a way in. The discovery sent another wave of fear through her. Knowing that the fugitive had been inside her house, so close to her, was almost too much to bear. As the investigation continued, the police found more evidence that pointed to the fugitive. Footprints in the garden matched the description of the escaped prisoner's shoes, and a piece of fabric caught on the fence seemed to belong to him as well. Each discovery confirmed her worst fears. The officers tried to reassure her, promising that they would do everything in their power to catch the fugitive. They advised her to stay with a friend or relative for a few days, just to be safe. She nodded numbly, still in shock from the morning's events. Her neighbor, who had heard the commotion, offered to let her stay at their house. She gratefully accepted, packing a small bag with essentials while the police continued their work. She couldn't bear to stay in her home, not after what had happened. Before she left, one of the officers took her aside. "We're going to keep a close watch on your house," he said gently. "And we'll find this guy, I promise. You're not alone in this." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. The reassurance was comforting, but it couldn't erase the fear that had taken root in her heart. She left with her neighbor, looking back at her home with a heavy heart. The police remained at the house, continuing their investigation. They collected evidence, took photographs, and documented everything meticulously. The message on the wall, written in her dog's blood, was a stark reminder of the brutality of the fugitive. As the day turned to evening, the lady sat at her neighbor's house, trying to process everything that had happened. The sense of safety and security she had once felt was shattered. The comfort of her dog's presence, the routine that had brought her peace, was gone. The investigation continued for days, with the police following every lead. The town was on high alert, the community rallying together to support the lady and ensure that the fugitive was caught. But despite their efforts, the fear lingered. Every night, as she lay in the unfamiliar bed at her neighbor's house, the events replayed in her mind. The realization that the fugitive had been so close, that he had violated the sanctity of her home, was a constant source of terror. Her once peaceful life was forever changed, replaced by an unending sense of dread and the haunting memory of that fateful night. In the weeks that followed, the lady struggled to come to terms with what had happened. Her once peaceful home now felt like a place of nightmares. The sense of safety and security she had always taken for granted was shattered. Every creak of the house, every shadow cast by the moonlight, sent her heart racing with fear. The loss of her loyal companion was a heavy blow. Her dog had been her constant source of comfort and protection. Without him, the house felt unbearably empty. She missed his reassuring presence, his warmth at her feet, and the simple comfort of knowing he was there to watch over her. The chilling message left by the intruder haunted her thoughts. "A humans can lick too." The words were burned into her memory, a stark reminder of the terror she had narrowly escaped. The sheer malice and brutality of the act left her with a deep sense of unease. She couldn't stop wondering about the fugitive's intentions. Why had he chosen her house? Why had he killed her dog and left that horrifying message? The questions swirled in her mind, unanswered and unsettling. The not knowing was the worst part, leaving her imagination to fill in the terrifying gaps. The police continued their search, but the fugitive remained elusive. Despite their reassurances, the lady couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching and waiting. The thought of him being at large filled her with a perpetual sense of dread. Her daily routines were forever changed. She no longer took her morning walks or spent time in her garden. The fear of being watched, of being vulnerable, was too great. She kept the curtains drawn and the doors locked, living in a constant state of vigilance. Nights were the hardest. The darkness seemed to amplify her fears, and sleep was elusive. Every noise, no matter how small, jolted her awake. She would lay there in the dark, clutching the blankets, her mind replaying the events over and over again. Her neighbors and friends tried to offer support, but they couldn't fully understand the depth of her fear. The community rallied around her, but the sense of isolation was overwhelming. She felt trapped in her own home, unable to escape the memories of that night. The impact of the incident rippled through the small town. People were more cautious, more aware of their surroundings. The sense of safety that had once defined their community was replaced by an undercurrent of fear. The fugitive's presence loomed over them all, a dark shadow that refused to lift. As the months passed, the lady tried to find ways to cope. She sought therapy, hoping to regain some semblance of normalcy. She adopted another dog, hoping the new companion might help fill the void left by her lost friend. But the fear remained, a constant companion that no amount of comfort could fully erase. The unanswered questions continued to haunt her. She wondered if she would ever feel safe again, if the sense of peace she once knew would ever return. The memory of the intruder's message, the horror of that night, stayed with her, a reminder of how quickly life can change. Even as time went on, the fugitive was never found. The thought that he was still out there somewhere left a lingering sense of unease. The community remained vigilant, their lives forever altered by the events of that night. In the end, the lady learned to live with her fear, finding small moments of comfort where she could. But the impact of that night, the loss of her loyal companion, and the haunting message left by the intruder were scars that would never fully heal. The shadow of the fugitive remained, a constant reminder that sometimes, the worst fears are the ones that linger long after the danger has passed.